There is a tablet buried for 4,000 years that does not speak of gods as loving creators. It speaks of a God who looked at suffering humanity and chose to keep it that way, not out of negligence, not out of ignorance, out of deliberate design. The cuneiform pressed into that clay describes Enlil, one of the most powerful deities in the Sumerian pantheon, sitting in divine council and making a decision that would shape every generation of human life that followed. The decision was not to protect humanity. It was not to elevate it. The decision was to ensure that pain remained a permanent feature of human existence. This is not mythology in the soft sense, the way we sometimes use that word to mean stories that are pretty but ultimately harmless. These tablets represent the earliest surviving theological framework in human history. They predate the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years, predate Homer, predate almost everything we call ancient. And they contain ideas so uncomfortable that scholars spent decades after their first translation struggling to contextualize what they were actually reading. What the tablets say about Enlil is not what most people expect from creation mythology. There is no tenderness here. There is no divine parent gazing lovingly at his creation. What there is instead is a God with a specific philosophy about what human life should feel like, and the will to enforce it. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Enlil was in the Sumerian world. Not as an abstract character in a distant myth, but as a living theological reality that shaped law, agriculture, kingship, war, and the daily prayers of millions of people across thousands of years. Enlil was not a minor deity. He was the Lord of the Air, the god who held the Tablet of Destinies, which in Sumerian theology meant he held the actual blueprint of reality. What he decreed became the structure of the world. What he withheld became the absence at the center of human life. The Sumerians were a civilization that emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the region we now call Iraq, around 5,000 years ago. They built the first cities. They invented writing, pressing meaning into soft clay before it hardened into permanence. They built ziggurats reaching toward heaven as houses for gods they genuinely believed were present in the world and paying attention. Their theology was not primitive. What the Sumerians built was sophisticated, internally consistent, and philosophically serious. They had creation narratives that grappled with the same questions theology still grapples with today. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they specified down to the degree, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Why does suffering exist? What is the relationship between divine will and human fate? Why do the gods allow what they allow? And unlike many later religious traditions, the Sumerians did not flinch from answers that were troubling. The Sumerian divine hierarchy was not a vague spiritual arrangement. It was a government, a cosmic bureaucracy with ranks, responsibilities, and internal politics. The Sumerians called the great gods the Anuna, arranged in descending tiers of power and function. At the very top was An, the sky itself, the distant father god whose authority was absolute, but whose presence was remote. Below An, in practical power, was Enlil. If An was the constitutional authority of the Sumerian cosmos, Enlil was the executive. He was the one who acted, who decreed, who implemented the decisions of heaven and the world below. The Sumerians described his voice as the storm, his breath as the wind that could strip crops from fields and cities from the earth. The third member of the Great Triad was Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and what the Sumerians called the Me, those fundamental principles of civilization that made ordered human life possible. Enki was cunning where Enlil was forceful. He was inventive where Enlil was authoritative. And crucially, Enki often stood as the advocate for humanity in divine councils, where Enlil was not inclined toward advocacy at all. That tension between Enlil and Enki runs directly through the tablet we are examining, because the debate about how much pain humans should carry was not, according to the Sumerian scribes, settled without argument. Enki pushed back. Enki intervened. And what happened when he did tells us something essential about what the tablet is actually saying about divine intentions and human fate. The theological core of the matter begins with the creation narrative itself. In the Sumerian understanding, humans were not created out of divine love or creative impulse. Humans were created because the gods were tired. This is not a metaphor or a euphemism. The tablets say it plainly. Before humans existed, the Anuna gods had to do their own work. They had to dig the canals, maintain the irrigation systems, plant the crops, manage the rivers, and the labor was exhausting them. The text described divine rebellion, lesser gods going on strike, refusing to continue their assigned tasks, demanding relief. It was in response to this divine labor crisis that Enki proposed the creation of humanity. The plan was to make beings capable of doing the work the gods no longer wanted to do. Humanity was, in the most literal sense the Sumerian texts can manage, a labor-saving device for the divine class. This origin story is the foundation on which Enlil's attitude toward human pain rests. If humans were made to work, then the capacity for suffering is not a flaw in the design but a feature of it. A being that cannot feel the weight of labor cannot be motivated to continue laboring. A being incapable of pain cannot be kept in line. But the tablet goes further than this functional argument. It describes something that looks more like Enlil's specific disposition toward humanity, something the scribes recorded not as policy but as character. The texts that cluster around Enlil's relationship with humanity consistently describe his fundamental attitude as contempt, or at best indifference, toward human suffering as a moral category. When humans suffer, Enlil does not register it as a problem requiring solution. He registers it as the correct state of affairs. The noise of humanity, its crying, its groaning, its accumulated weight of distress, is in multiple texts described as something that bothers Enlil, but not because he feels compassion. It bothers him the way noise bothers someone trying to sleep. This is most explicit in the Great Flood narrative, which the Sumerians told centuries before the Hebrew flood story. In the Sumerian version, which predates the book of Genesis by over 1,000 years, the reason Enlil sends the flood is not because humanity has become morally corrupt. The reason is because there are too many humans, and they are too loud. The population had grown. The noise had become unbearable to him, and so he decided to destroy them. In the biblical version, God sends the flood because humans have become wicked. There is ethical content in the Genesis flood. God has reasons that fit within a framework of divine justice. Enlil does not have those reasons. Enlil is simply bothered by the noise, and the solution he reaches for is annihilation. Enki circumvents Enlil's plan by warning Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah figure, to build a vessel and survive. He does this through a technicality, speaking the warning to the wall of Ziusudra's house, rather than to Ziusudra himself, maintaining plausible deniability within the rules of divine counsel. But notice what this reveals. Enki intervenes not because the divine order protects humanity, but despite the divine order. Humanity survives the flood because one god bent the rules. The default position of the divine hierarchy was extinction. Survival was the exception. The tablet engages with a concept the Sumerians called the gig, which translates roughly as disease, pain, or the affliction that attaches itself to the body. The text addresses why this gig was made permanent. The divine council had a debate. The mother goddess figure, associated with Ninhursag and Ninmah in different versions of the mythology, argued that humans, having been created to serve the gods, should at least receive some relief from the worst of their suffering. Enlil's response is what makes the text so theologically striking. He does not argue that pain is necessary for human function. He argues something closer to the position that pain is the appropriate condition for a being of humanity's status, that it fits the hierarchy, that a being created to serve should feel the weight of that role in its body as well as its labor. This is not the same as arguing that pain is useful. It is arguing that pain is fitting. And that distinction matters enormously, because it means Enlil's position is not a pragmatic calculation, but a philosophical statement about what humans deserve to experience by virtue of what they are. The tablet does not record any divine majority overruling Enlil on this point. The mother goddess introduces modifications, beings that fall outside the clean category of servant and tool. But these are accommodations, not reversals. The underlying framework remains. Pain is the appropriate texture of human life. And the Sumerian scribes recorded this not because they were telling a story about how things used to be before some liberation arrived, but because they believed it described how things still were. There's a text scholars sometimes call the Lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, containing one of the most direct theological statements in all of Sumerian literature about divine will and human suffering. Written after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2000 BCE, when the great civilization of southern Mesopotamia was collapsing under the pressure of invaders and internal crisis, it was produced by scribes recording a catastrophe they had lived through. The goddess Ningal, divine protector of the city of Ur, is given a long speech in which she describes going before the divine assembly and pleading for her city. She describes weeping before An and Enlil. She describes prostrating herself and begging for her people. And the text records the response of the divine assembly with a stark simplicity that reads like a door closing. The decree was not changed. Enlil had spoken. And Ningal was left to watch as her city burned. What the Lamentation scribes understood is that divine protection does not override divine decision. The gods who loved particular humans and particular cities could not protect them against the will of the God who held the Tablet of Destinies. This is not presented as a malfunction of the divine system. It is presented as the system working exactly as designed. This connects directly to the question of why Enlil wanted humans to feel pain. The Sumerian theological answer is that Enlil did not see pain as something external being imposed on humanity unfairly. He saw pain as built into the relationship between humans and the divine order, a relationship defined from the beginning by absolute inequality. Gods above, humans below. And the distance between those positions measured in the texture of daily physical experience. Humans get sick, gods do not. Humans die, gods do not. Humans labor until their bodies break. These are not accidents in the Sumerian cosmology. They are the defining features of the ontological categories themselves. Where the tablet becomes particularly striking is in the moments when it moves beyond describing what pain does to humans and begins to describe what Enlil seems to feel about it. There are passages that suggest something more active than indifference, something closer to satisfaction in the maintenance of proper order. When humans are in pain, they are in their correct category. When they suffer, the hierarchy is legible. When they cry out and receive no answer, the distance between mortal and immortal is properly maintained. The Sumerian scribes were not writing this as a critique. They were writing it as a description. They believed this was true, and they built an entire civilization on top of that belief. The ziggurat was built as a house for the god. The king was a steward. His authority derived entirely from divine appointment. The farmer planting crops was not feeding himself first. He was feeding the temple, the divine household, because that was the order of things, and the order of things was Enlil's order. Consider what it means to live inside a theology that says pain is correct, that suffering is appropriate, that the God who holds the Tablet of Destinies looked at the possibility of a world with less human pain in it and chose not to build that world. You do not petition for relief in that system. You do not develop the expectation that things should be otherwise. The entire category of cosmic injustice, the sense that pain is something that should not be happening and needs to be addressed, does not operate in the Sumerian theological framework the way it operates in traditions that came later. The Hebrew prophetic tradition, which emerged in part from a culture deeply familiar with Mesopotamian mythology, is built on exactly that category. The prophets rage against the conditions of their world as people who believe the world could and should be different. Amos demanding justice rolling down like water. Isaiah describing a transformed world in which the suffering of the present is not the final word. These are visions rooted in the belief that the current state of human suffering is not what the divine intended and is not permanent. That prophetic framework is simply not available inside Sumerian theology. Enlil wanted this. This is what he built. The appropriate response is not protest, but endurance. And yet the Sumerian literary tradition is not without its own form of protest. It is a quieter, more oblique protest. The texts that describe Enki's interventions, his finding of loopholes in divine decrees, his willingness to warn Ziusudra about the flood, function in the mythology as a kind of counter-narrative. Where Enlil sees humans and sees noise, sees a management problem, Enki sees something he helped to create and cannot entirely give up on. In the mythology, Enki wins individual battles through cleverness, while Enlil maintains structural dominance through authority. The flood comes and Enki saves one family. But Enlil's authority is not fundamentally challenged. Enki is hope without transformation. He is the god who might warn you before the flood but cannot prevent the flood from being decreed. He is the limit of what the Sumerian theological imagination could imagine as divine benevolence, operating inside a system designed by Enlil. And that limit tells us something profound about the civilization that produced these texts. A civilization capable of extraordinary engineering and literary achievement, and that nonetheless looked at its world honestly and concluded that the power at the top of its cosmic hierarchy was not oriented toward their well-being. They pressed that conclusion into clay. They baked it and stored it in temple libraries where it survived 4,000 years, waiting. The tablets were found before anyone had the tools to read them. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script the Sumerians invented, and that was adopted by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Hittites over 2,000 years, was deciphered gradually through the 19th century. As the language cracked open, libraries of tablets began to yield their contents, and among those contents were texts that scholars were not entirely prepared to encounter. George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum in the 1870s, was among the first to recognize that cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh contained flood narratives structurally parallel to the story in Genesis. When he translated enough text to recognize what he was reading, the account of his reaction has him rising from his chair and beginning to undress in the reading room of the museum, apparently overcome by the magnitude of what he had found. That reaction was not disproportionate. What Smith understood in that moment was that the biblical flood story was not original, that it had predecessors. That the Hebrew scribes had worked within a narrative tradition far older than the texts they were producing, and that the older tradition had a very different theology at its center. The Sumerian version does not feature a god who destroys humanity because of sin. It features a god who destroys humanity because of noise. The moral architecture of the two stories is completely different, and that difference reflects entirely different theological universes. As more tablets were translated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the picture of Sumerian theology became clearer and more disorienting. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, who dedicated most of his career to translating and interpreting Sumerian literature, described the Sumerian worldview as one of the most pessimistic in the ancient world. But he was careful to distinguish between pessimism as a mood and pessimism as a theological conclusion reached after careful observation. The Sumerians were not despairing people who had given up. They were people who had looked clearly at the structure of their world and described what they saw without the kind of theological optimism that later traditions built into their frameworks. What they saw was Enlil. And the text about his design for human pain is, within this broader context, not an outlier but one of its most honest expressions. It says what the broader system implies, but rarely states so directly, that the God who governs the world did not design it with human comfort as a priority. That suffering is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be endured. And yet, even within this framework, the Sumerian scribes were not entirely silent about their experience of it. The lamentations are genuine. The goddess Ningal weeping before the divine assembly is not a detached theological exercise. The texts carry emotional weight because the people who produced them were feeling what they were describing. They were inside the theology and they were suffering, and they knew the suffering was cosmologically correct, and they were grief-stricken about it anyway. This is perhaps the most human thing in all of these ancient texts. The ability to know that your pain has been designed, to accept it as the structure of the world, and to grieve it anyway. The theological ideas embedded in these Sumerian tablets did not stay in Sumer. The Akkadians absorbed Sumerian culture so thoroughly that by the time of the Great Empire under Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BCE, the distinction between Sumerian and Akkadian religious thought had blurred significantly. The Akkadian version of the flood myth, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a direct descendant of the Sumerian story of Ziusudra. The god who sends the flood is still Enlil. The god who saves the flood hero is still Enki. The logic of the story is the same. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor of the flood is granted immortality and placed at the mouth of the rivers, removed from the world of ordinary mortals. This is presented as exceptional, underscoring the general rule. Ordinary humans die. Ordinary humans suffer. Ordinary humans do not receive exemption from the conditions Enlil built into the human category. Gilgamesh himself is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, and even with that extraordinary proportion of the divine in his nature, he cannot escape mortality. His companion Enkidu dies. His own death approaches. And the epic asks not whether the divine order is just, but how a being inside that order should live, knowing what the order is. The answer it arrives at is to embrace the immediate goods of mortal life because they are what is available. The Hebrew tradition, which developed in direct contact with Mesopotamian civilization, is the place where the most significant transformation of this framework happened. The book of Job makes that transformation explicit. Job suffers. His suffering is not the result of sin. His friends insist it must be, because that is how the theology they have inherited says the divine-human relationship works. But Job insists on his innocence and demands an explanation. He takes the divine to court, arguing that the structure of his suffering is cosmologically unjust and that he is entitled to an answer. This has no real parallel in Sumerian literature. The divine response from the whirlwind does not exactly answer Job's question. It overwhelms it with the scale of the divine. But the very fact that God responds, that God engages with the question at all, marks a fundamental difference from the Sumerian framework. Enlil does not respond to the lamentation of Ningal by explaining himself. He decrees, and the decree is the end of the conversation. The God of Job at least shows up. The divine silence of Enlil, and the divine presence of the God who speaks from the whirlwind, are not the same theological reality, even if the suffering they are responding to is structurally similar. This development was not inevitable. It was a choice, the Hebrew theological tradition, made gradually, through centuries of engagement with exactly the kind of material we find in the Sumerian tablets. The choice to insist on divine accountability, to demand that pain be explainable within a framework of justice, is a theological departure from the Enlil framework. A departure that required arguing against the foundational premises of the oldest recorded theology in human history. Egyptian theology operated within the concept of Ma'at, usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, a concept with no direct equivalent in Sumerian thought. Ma'at was not just a description of how things are, it was a moral ideal, describing how things should be, and it created an obligation, not just for humans, but for the divine itself, to maintain a world in which the scales of justice were balanced. The Egyptian gods were not exempt from Ma'at. Ra himself was expected to operate within it. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of divine order, had the primary human responsibility for maintaining Ma'at, which is why Egyptian royal ideology is saturated with language about justice and protection of the weak. The contrast with Enlil's framework could not be sharper. In the Sumerian tablets, pain is what humans are supposed to feel. In the Egyptian framework, pain is what happens when the world has gone wrong. Sumerian religious practice is fundamentally about maintenance. You perform the rituals to maintain the divine order as it is, because the divine order as it is what Enlil established. Egyptian religious practice has a restoration dimension built into it. The rituals of the temple participate in sustaining Ma'at, holding the world in right order against the forces of chaos. There is something to fight for, something defined by justice rather than just power. The Sumerian farmer enduring crop failure inside an Enlil-governed cosmos has a different interior life than the Egyptian farmer enduring the same crop failure inside a Ma'at-governed cosmos. Not because their suffering is different in kind or intensity, but because the meaning structure they bring to it is fundamentally different. One is living inside a world correctly designed to include his pain. The other is living inside a world that has temporarily gone wrong and might be made right again. The tablets that describe Enlil's design for human suffering are, among other things, a window into a civilization that had made the first choice. The choice to say that suffering is built into the category of being human, and that the God who built it that way has not erred. And that window, 4,000 years after the clay dried and the civilization that produced it was buried under the dust of later empires, is still capable of producing discomfort that comes from encountering a theological position you are not prepared for. Because whatever we believe about the nature of the divine, whatever tradition we come from or reject, most of us have absorbed some version of the premise that suffering is not what we are supposed to feel. That pain needs justification. That it is exceptional rather than structural. The Sumerian tablets challenge that premise at the root. They say, in the careful wedge-shaped script of the earliest writing system in human history, that there was a moment, preserved in clay, that survived 4 millennia, when the question of why humans feel pain had an answer so direct, it left no room for the comforting theology that came after it. Enlil decided. The tablet records the decision. And what you do with that, how you carry it, whether it changes anything about how you understand the world you live in now, is a question that 4,000 years of human history has not fully resolved, and that perhaps was never meant to be.